Chancellor Milliken joined the University of Texas in September 2018, having previously served in leadership positions at the City University of New York, the University of Nebraska, and the University of North Carolina. He is a fifth-generation Nebraskan and is the first alumnus of the University of Nebraska to serve as president of the university. He's the recipient of numerous awards, including the Distinguished Nebraskan Award presented by the state's governor and the Lifetime Achievement Award from the City and State of New York. Chancellor Milliken will participate in a moderated conversation with Rob Kaplan, who is the current president and CEO of the Dallas Fed. Before joining the Fed, Rob was a professor and senior associate dean at Harvard Business School, which he joined after a long business career at Goldman Sachs. We will be taking audience questions during the event this evening, and we'd love to hear from you. If you would like to ask the speakers a live question, please click the raise hand icon on the bottom of the control bar to enter the queue. If you would prefer to submit a written question, use the Q&A button on the bottom of the control bar to submit your question to the queue. We will try to get to as many questions as possible and also try to address questions in the order in which they are received. We apologize in advance if we do not get to your question. And with that, I will turn things over to Rob. Rob?
Thank you, Mark. Chancellor Milliken, thank you for being here. Just for the audience, Chancellor Milliken goes by JB. So I may call him JB on occasion tonight, but JB, it's great to have you here, and we're thrilled to have everybody in the audience for this Global Perspective session. And so I'm going to get right into it. You went to University of Nebraska, then you went to law school in New York City, and you worked as a lawyer for a number of years in New York City, and then you decided to go back to your old alma mater. And to work in higher education. How did you make that decision, and what caused you to make that decision?
First of all, Rob, thanks very much for having me back after our March session was abruptly canceled, like everything else in the world. Right. So you might be giving me too much credit about decision-making in my life. I've sort of become convinced that life is directed by a bunch of elements, including accident and serendipity and purpose and preparation. If I hadn't gone to Washington after I graduated from college, I probably would not have gotten a fellowship to go to NYU Law School. And if I hadn't gone to NYU Law School, I wouldn't have met my wife of 31 years. And if I hadn't met my wife of 31 years, who was adventuresome and liked to move, I probably wouldn't have left New York City. So that's kind of the accident and serendipity, but maybe the purpose and the preparation is I knew I wanted to be a lawyer, but not really practice law. I wanted to be in public policy in some way. And when I left New York and became chief of staff to a university president in 1988, I decided that's the career where I thought I could have the most impact, use my educational and political background. And so I did everything I could to learn about higher education and the intersection of policy and politics and education, and move many times to be successful as what is considered a non-traditional candidate in this field.
And you might explain, you became a university president in 2004, and non-traditional that you didn't have a PhD, correct? And that's kind of unusual for university presidents.
You know, actually, Rob, that is not the most unusual thing, because at one point in the Ivies, back in, I think in the 80s and 90s, at least half of the presidents were JDs.
Wow.
Yale, Harvard, Columbia.
Okay.
So having a terminal degree is important. And to my friends who are lawyers in this audience, you know, you too have a terminal degree.
There's hope for you.
What's non-traditional is not having been, you know, starting as a newly minted faculty member, even if it were in a law school, becoming a department chair, a dean, a provost. That's still more often than not the career trajectory.
And so when you became university president at Nebraska, how did you find it? And you had already been in the arena and you'd been working with university presidents. How big of a challenge was it? And what was your biggest challenge in doing that job?
Well, somebody told me, a president I worked for when I was a number two, that the difference between number 1 and 2 is much greater than the distance between anybody else in the organization. And I came to recognize that pretty quickly. You know, if you're not the number 1, you may find it easier to go to sleep at night sometimes. But I became president there after having served as senior vice president of the University of North Carolina system, which was a much larger system and in some ways more advanced in some of the things that I was interested in. So that learning and that experience was very helpful when I came back to Nebraska. And throughout my career, I've just been able to build on the sets of experiences at each of these places.
So some people may ask, and I've seen it myself up close, but you might explain, how does a university president, we'll get to chancellor in a little bit, how does a university president spend his or her time?
Well, you know, that's an interesting question. And, you know, in the time of COVID, it might be different than in another time. You know, when somebody first told me that you'd spend a minimum of 40% of your time in development, raising money,
right,
before I was in the chair, I thought that was probably an exaggeration. Then when I went to Nebraska, we did a major capital campaign, and my wife told me, who's a good observer, impartial, that you're spending 60 or 70% of your time on that. So, you know, once it depends on the system, of course, and the state, how much the president versus the chancellor, and the nomenclature changes from state to state. California is the opposite of us. So a good deal of your time, depending on how the state's structured, has to be spent with politics. The legislature and the governor are the most important funders of public universities in this country. Fundraising from private donors, foundations, and others has increasingly over the last few decades become a very important part of public higher education. It's been an important part of private for a long time. But those two areas are really enormously important to the institution, and they are, in some cases, areas where you have to have the first name president or chancellor to be able to be effective. So that's an enormously important part. Of course, there are a whole range of policy and management issues running a large organization. You know, the University of Texas system, for instance, just to make sure everybody has a sense of the scale, has 240,000 students and over 100,000 employees. And I want to be clear, that doesn't mean that, you know, we have an employee for every 2.4 students. Many of those employees are in our health science centers and in the hospitals, and so that's an enormous part of it. But they're the same kinds of management issues you'd have at any large organization.
How big was the University of Nebraska? It's very large.
Yeah, no, it's about 50,000 students, about 15,000 faculty and staff. North Carolina is a little over 200,000 students, and City University of New York was about 280,000 students.
So we're going to go to New York next, and then we'll come back and we'll talk in depth about what you're doing now. A lot of folks, and I saw this myself, find that one of the challenges of a university president is managing the faculty. And I've had to explain to a lot of people, it's a little different than in business, where you have lines of authority and they don't have to worry about tenure. What are some of the challenges in managing faculty, and how's that different than managing people in business?
Well, to start with, my colleagues on the faculty would take some umbrage at the expression "managing the faculty."
So it starts with that, yeah.
You know, so there is a tradition in higher education in this country, in fact, around the world, and in some cases it's stronger than it is here, of shared governance, where the faculty retain certain governance rights, with regard to recommending people for promotion and tenure, with regard to developing the curriculum, with regard to determining the requirements for degree in a particular program. And so, there are similarities at all of these institutions, public and private, about the areas that are within the domain of the faculty and the areas that are in the domain of the administration or the management.
Okay, so I'm gonna skip quickly. You went from Nebraska to then you became a chancellor, and obviously you've been a chancellor for in New York for the system there, and then you decided to come here and be chancellor for the University of Texas system. And you might just start with explaining, and it's been explained to me several times, what's the difference in role between a university president and a chancellor of a university system?
Well, okay, so this is where we get into the nomenclature, which is a little tricky. Basically, there's an individual who is the head of a system of universities, and that's either a president or a chancellor. In Texas, it's a chancellor, but in the UC system in California or the UNC system in North Carolina, that person's called the president. And here are our university heads are called presidents, and those other two examples, they're called chancellors. But those are the people, I'll use president because that's what we're used to here. The people on the campus are managing the day-to-day activities, and depending on the system, making it a whole range of decisions for that enterprise. The people who sit in the job of system head or chancellor are working directly for a board in Texas, the Board of Regents, are concerned with overarching policy matters, are concerned with overarching funding of in our case, 14 institutions, in charge of a regulatory and compliance environment, ensuring that the board meets its fiduciary obligations, and concerned as being typically the primary spokesperson for and advocate for, with the legislature, governor, and others, the interests of the university system, but also in most cases, higher education even more broadly. Higher education imperatives for a state or a region. And so the president would spend much more time with faculty, deans, other academic administrators than a chancellor. A chancellor would typically spend much more time with legislators and others, and the board.
And so in that role, what's the one or two top policy issues? We'll talk about COVID in a moment, but what are the top one or two policy issues that you've had to tackle since being in this job? What have been your priorities?
Well, so when I came to, obviously they're a little different everywhere, depending on the environment, the needs, et cetera. I mean, New York City, 24 institutions, very different kind of place. When I came to Texas, something sort of smacked me in the face. I had lunch with the state demographer the first month I was here, and I heard him say that the population in the state may double in 30 years. Yeah. Then I looked at the educational attainment rates in Texas. We're about 34th in the country. Yeah. And I looked at the healthcare outcomes, which we have an enormous responsibility for with 6 large health science centers. And again, we're about 34th in the country in terms of health outcomes. So it seemed to me that it's pretty evident that the grand challenge for Texas, where our educational attainment rates are not quite where most of us would want them to be today to be as competitive as possible, and our health outcomes are not where we would want them to be today, gets enormously more difficult with a population doubling. And we have either the second or third youngest population in the country, and that will continue as we grow. So we've got a whole bunch of people in this pipeline that we can't educate today with the infrastructure we have. And we need to figure out now how to do this over the next couple of decades as we grow. So those, I think, frame for the University of Texas system, and frankly, for all of higher education in Texas, what our sort of grand challenges are. And we'll get to this, but I think there are some silver linings and some learnings from COVID that will maybe help us get there.
So how many students in the system you oversee?
240,000.
240,000 students. And 25 years from now, your judgment is, how big will that population be then?
Well, I think the population will be much bigger, but I don't know that, UT Austin has 51,000 students. Is the population on that campus, landlocked in a large city, going to be double because we have to educate twice as many students? No, not a chance in my view. So I don't know what the population will be, but I do think that higher education is changing in ways that will help us educate a much broader number of Texans. And part of that will be online.
Right.
Part of it will be in certificate programs. Part of it will be working with employers on what is needed for an entry-level position. We can't afford in this country, I don't believe, to say that we certainly can't afford in Texas, where we have a rapidly growing, maybe New Hampshire can afford this, but we can't say we're going to educate every 18-year-old in 10 or 20 years exactly the way we did it 20 years ago. We're not going to make the investment, I don't believe, in these expensive institutions, which are enormously important and vital to the future of the state. And we don't want to diminish that at all. I mean, just another element of this is we do over $3 billion worth of research every year. And we want to grow that number. And to grow that number, we've got to have smart faculty and postdocs and graduate students and undergraduates in an environment like a university. But not everyone is going to have that same experience, I don't believe, and not everybody's going to want that same experience.
So what will be how will it change? What will the variety of experiences be that might surprise people in the audience?
Well, it may not surprise people. There's been a fair amount written about this. I mean, about a couple of years ago, we reached a tipping point in this country where half or over half of the college students enrolled were at community colleges. And that's way different than a few decades ago. Yeah. Community colleges are less expensive to stand up. They tend to be, I think most people would say, they tend to be more nimble. They're not, what's a nice word for hidebound? The cultures are different at those places. And so I think they will grow very significantly.
Those will be 2-year community colleges or 4-year?
Yeah, they'll be 2-year. I think 2-year community colleges will grow significantly, but they will also change what they do. They will do much more online, and they will do much more certificate programs and
skills
sort of
training,
skilling throughout careers, which is going to be increasingly important. So that'll happen. There'll be more transfers from community colleges to senior colleges. So to the extent we grow, it may be that we are growing in senior, junior, sophomore more than freshmen. Right. For people who want to continue their academic career from community colleges. I think we will see, and I know we're going to get to COVID, but I think we will see that this has in some way, I don't want to scare people because I'm a huge believer in the residential college and the value of having a whole bunch of smart people together, both for students learning and for the research and innovation that happens. But this is the disruptive moment in higher education that has been either threatened by people on Wall Street and in Silicon Valley for years as the last major industry that hasn't been disrupted, or promised by people who think that's a great thing. But I do believe this is a disruptive moment. We have, I think, taken about what might take 5 years to learn and to progress and compressed it.
Because of
And
COVID.
Because of COVID.
So let's get right into that. So when COVID began to become emerge and it became apparent what was happening, when did it first come to your attention or your view that you're going to have to make dramatic changes?
Well, in the middle of March, by that time, we had already worked with our Board of Regents and with our presidents and had I would say, a uniform, certainly consensus, probably uniform view that we need to shut down. We need to get everybody out of our campuses. So March 17th, we sent a letter out across the UT system that said, if your students are on spring break, don't have them come back from spring break. We need to send people home. We need to move to finish the semester online. So that was when it happened. And I will say that in 32 years now in higher education, I'm not sure I've ever seen anything quite so impressive, certainly so dramatic, as the pivot over 1 to 2 weeks. We had under 20% of our faculty who had ever taught a course online. And 40% of our students had ever taken one course or more. And in 2 weeks' time, it was 100%.
So you sent people home, but you picked up classes how many weeks after that online?
People were ready to go within 2 weeks' time after that. Now, there are a lot of things, there were a huge number of moving parts. And this is what I think is so remarkable. We bought thousands of laptops for people. We set up hotspots in parking lots for people who didn't have broadband access at home. All kinds of things happened. Now, we kept probably system-wide about 4,000 students on the campus living there. Those were largely international students or other students who had nowhere or no ability to leave. So we kept some housing open and served meals.
And
but
then
the people, sorry, go ahead.
No, keep going. What you're going to say?
Well, I was just going to say that the remarkable thing is that our faculty, who, despite the fact that people like to think that universities are, liberal havens, they also think that faculty are very conservative and don't change much. That it's very difficult to get. This was an enormous change in a very short period of time, and I have to say I'm hugely impressed by what our faculty did and by our students' ability to adapt, because what that did was keep them on track to persist, and the people who were on track to graduate in May graduated in May.
Wow, that's great. And did you have did you have people that helped teach faculty how to adapt to the new system?
Yeah, but 2 weeks is not a long time to learn how to use.
It's not. So how'd they do it?
What's that?
How did they do it? I mean, I was part of a project at HBS called HBX, which is online. And I will tell you, it took a while. It took me a while to figure out how to teach virtually. How did you get them to make that adjustment so quickly, or how did they do it?
Well, I won't tell you that it was all the best pedagogy using the most advanced instructional technology available on the market. A lot of it was this. I mean, a lot of it was moving class to Zoom. And that was the stopgap. Now, in the spring and in the summer, we invested a significant amount in training sessions because we knew that when we came back in the fall, it was going to be largely online. So that's when we had an opportunity to work with faculty and provide training on the platforms and how to bring other kinds of technological tools into your teaching. And we'll continue to do that. People are learning and adapting.
So rolling forward to this fall, what percentage of your students are virtual versus on campus?
So 2 quick data points, and then I'll get to that. The first one is, even given this experience, enrollment went up system-wide in the summer.
Wow.
And it went up this fall. So we have more students enrolled this fall than we did last fall. About half our campuses had increases and about half had decreases. The most dramatic is almost 4,000 student increase in the Rio Grande Valley. The most significant decrease is at UT Dallas, and the reason for that is a large number of international graduate students. And we may not have time to get to this, but this has been a very difficult year for international students who weren't already here to come here.
What percentage of your student body is international?
It's about 20,000 students.
Okay, out of 240.
Yeah.
And I take it those 20,000, if they left, it's not able to come back.
If they left, it was hard to come back. Many of the embassies and consulates didn't have their visa windows open, and that's been a real struggle. So some of them may have been able to work online from a remote source, but others stayed here. A lot of our international students stayed in the United States so they wouldn't have to address that. Now, the question about who's online and who's not.
Yeah.
It's different at each campus. And, there are a lot of reasons. We set a number of kind of broad guideposts, but we encouraged each president and their team to think creatively about their locale, the composition of their student body. I mean, some are heavily residential, some are heavily commuter. So there were differences at each place. Some had big Division I athletics, others didn't. So it's a different mix. At UT Austin, for instance, I would say that about 5% of the classes are traditional face-to-face. About 15% are hybrid, where a fair part of it's online. The students are in Austin and meet maybe once a week. And then the rest is online. A lot of the students are there. They're using the library. They're using the fitness facilities. They're living together and working together. At some of our smaller campuses, there is a larger number of in-person, but still the maximum would be, it'd certainly be less than half of the students. Most places, it is predominantly online and then a mix of hybrid and in-person. So when people say to me, the University of North Carolina had to shut down and send people home, and you may have to do that too. Well, if we had to do it, we did it at a much larger scale last spring, and we would have much less to do now. But we happen to think our campuses are pretty safe places compared to the population, compared to the world at large. We have a lot of testing. We have a lot of capacity for isolating and quarantining. And I visited the 8 academic campuses since they opened. And at each one, I've been remarkably impressed. You're thinking of 18 and 19 and 20-year-olds of the social distancing. Everyone has a mask. You might have 25 people in what used to be a large lecture hall because they're spaced out. So it's, our key words for this fall were flexibility, adaptability, resilience.
Okay, that's great. And your expectation right now is your plan, this is likely to go on through the rest of the spring semester?
Yes. I mean, like everyone else, we hoped when we were preparing for the fall that spring would, be more like it looked like now. I used to say last year, now I got to say 2 years ago.
Right.
But it'll look much more like this fall.
Okay. Now, you and I have spoken about the challenges of recent graduates in finding jobs, and I know you've done a lot of work on this, and I'll mention a statistic to the audience which has surprised me. We've been surprised at a couple of statistics. The unemployment rate for college graduates is actually right now a few tenths of a percent higher than at the height of the financial crisis. And that surprised me that that's happened. And oh, by the way, separately, which is probably some related, some unrelated, the unemployment rate in the U.S. Population among 20 to 24-year-olds right now is 12%. versus an overall unemployment rate of about 8.4%. So there's something very challenging going on with our young people. I wonder if you could just talk about, I know you've done a lot of work on this.
Yeah. So a couple things that I would say. First one I would say, and maybe we'll come back to this about the imperative for opening in the fall. And part of that relates to the employment possibilities for those students, which was, when I was looking at this earlier, was like 30% for those without a degree in that age group. You know, and our students, 45% are on Pell Grants. They're not going to go on the grand tour or take a gap year and do something other than work.
Right.
So that's one of the reasons that we thought we needed to get back into a routine of persisting in higher education. But you're right, Rob. I've looked at those numbers, and they were startling when I first saw them also. And so I'm working with a group nationally and in Texas to try to figure out why this exists. And I have to think that it's people with entry-level jobs just turning down the control knob because they're worried about what's going to happen. But I think we need to address that population, which includes the class of 2020 that graduated last May, but it's probably going to include the next couple of years also. And what do we need to do to intervene with that vulnerable group, which is up around 14% unemployment, to make them more marketable? I do think this is part of a larger trend, which is that people are going to need to upskill, retool, whatever the word is, throughout their career now. And we're just seeing it because of COVID happening much more rapidly and earlier than we ever imagined it would. So I think we've got a whole new set of skills that we need to think about. Those people that graduated and have degrees, they may have to think differently about what the job market looks like than they thought when they were a freshman or sophomore. And what do they need to do to position themselves to be an attractive candidate? And
so mention a few examples of the upskilling. So upskilling to what?
Well, how about coding? I mean, there's an industry in New York City with private providers and others to provide short-term coding certificates because of the growth in the tech industry, and the people are still hiring even when some others aren't, and hiring in great numbers. And at least they tell us that they aren't particularly concerned with what your degree is if you have the skills to do what they need done.
So will you start teaching, will you start adding coding to your curriculum then? Or beefing that up?
Coding in the curriculum now, but I do think that we are going to see, both at the community college level and at the senior college level, more of these short-term courses, more certificates that allow you to stack your credentials that make you more marketable. And I think we're seeing the evidence that matters in the marketplace.
And if I want to take a coding class to get this credential, how many weeks is that class?
It's all, it runs the gamut. But I would say, I was familiar with courses in New York that were 8 weeks.
Okay, wow. That's short. Interesting. Okay, interesting. All right, we're going to stop here, and we're going to turn to our audience, and I'll turn to my friend, Mr. Wynn, and we'll take some questions from the audience.
Great, thanks, Rob. And just a reminder to everybody that we also have an option to submit a live question if you're so inclined. The first question we have in the queue is, how do you see Zoom-based education interacting with in-person education to reduce the high cost of third-level education that is increasingly beyond the range of many middle-class families?
So the cost savings for what is referred to as a Zoom-based education is really about whether a student is going to live on campus and take advantage of all the other elements of that experience, because the largest part of our budget is personnel. It's talent that we're recruiting, and and a faculty member is spending as much time teaching a Zoom course as teaching one in person. In fact, there's a lot of literature available about the increased amount of time and effort that goes into teaching remotely well. So, a couple decades ago, people used to think, oh, online education is going to save us so much money because we're going to send VHS tapes out all over and people are going to watch them. That may exist, but that's not a high quality education that the University of Texas system would offer. And so what we found is you don't save a lot of money. I think the key here is, though, that remote education, whether it's Zoom-based or much more sophisticated technology, is going to allow you to do things where people are working and where they have challenges of distance, where they have families and they aren't going to uproot and go to college, or they just don't want to pay the full freight of being a part of that environment. We're going to be able, and everybody's going to be able to offer different options to them. And to me, that's part of what the future of higher education looks like.
So a related question is, do you see this requiring a need for a change in the business model for higher education, given the willingness to pay for online educations or totally online experience? I mean, I know you're not talking about exclusively online, but the willingness to pay is also going to change as you increase the online mix.
There are a lot of people who want today and are going to want in a number of years, pick a date, the experience of being at a residential campus. And as an educator, as somebody who had great experience in higher education, I would say they should value that. It's a tremendous opportunity, but it's not one that's going to be available for everyone, and it's not one that everybody wants. So to the extent the business model changes, it will change by having, I think, a variety of options that we will be, we'll have increasing opportunities for people to experience higher education in different ways. The one that we have today is not going to get less important.
Can I ask, what do you think the trends are likely to be for tuition? A lot's been discussed about the dramatic rise over the last 25, 30 years in college tuition. What do you think the trends are likely to be from here?
I don't see a huge amount of change. What's happened over the last however many decades, 1986 was about the high water mark in this country for the percentage of public higher education's budget that came from state general fund. And at almost every public university system in the country, at some point, the lines crossed of tuition percentage of budget and general fund percentage of budget. I can't say that I blame policymakers. I mean, they discovered that there's one place, healthcare isn't it, corrections isn't it, K-12 isn't it, where there's another source of revenue. And so it is in many states the largest discretionary item in the budget, and it has been reduced over time. The great benefit to Texans who go to the University of Texas system is that they are paying a fraction of the cost of supporting that enterprise. So they are paying, in fact, considerably less than how we would calculate the cost of education. So that's the great benefit in this country of public higher education, which produces 70% of the degrees nationwide. And I have to say, I'm going to use this chance, Rob, to put in a plug for why I think everyone ought to support it, that it is a public good, because it's not only that one individual is investing in their opportunity to make more money, but every social indicator we can look at improves with higher educational attainment rates. So, if you want civic participation, if you want philanthropy, if you want a reduction on the social welfare system and a reduction of incarceration and a reduction of divorce rates, educate more people. mean, everything that's good increases. So anyway, that went far afield from.
That's all right. That was worth saying,
translation.
though. That was worth saying. Go back to you, Mark.
Okay, another question related to funding. What incentives do private entities, firms, or foundations have to make donations to universities, either colleges or departments? And what do they expect in return, if anything?
Well, I think the tax code is part of an incentive if you're talking about sort of purely financial in the case of individual donors. What do they want in return? Somebody told me early on, and I like to believe this, so I do believe it, that as a fundraiser, which a president and a chancellor, they are, what you're doing is for the most part, trying to find a way to achieve someone else's passion, that a donor wants something to happen. They want the best business school in the country at McCombs, or the best actuarial science program, or the best electrical engineering program, or they care deeply about cancer research. And fortunately, we've got just the thing for you, because we've got places that do that as well as any place. So that's generally, I think, what donors want. Foundations and individual donors want to see more opportunity in this country, so they provide scholarship funds. I talk to the donors all the time, and they get an enormous sense of satisfaction out of that, I think.
By the way, can I just make one point and ask you to comment? People might be surprised to know, when you're talking about donors, what percentage of your budget or funds are restricted, meaning donor designates, and you don't have as much latitude with non-restricted funds. You might just explain that.
Yeah. So the most recent numbers I've seen, which are probably not completely current, but I doubt they change much, it was about 97% of the new gifts given to colleges and universities in this country were restricted by the donors. So all that means is that if Rob gives me $1,000 for a scholarship fund, that $1,000 got to be spent on that scholarship fund. I can't use that for maintenance at the fitness center. So most donors, and especially sophisticated donors, maybe not people who are just responding to the annual fund call from a student that are going to get off the phone by committing something. But these people have a very clear idea, maybe what their passion is, of how they want to support their alma mater, or just a great institution like MD Anderson, for instance. And the money is spent that way. And, so people say, well, you have this enormous endowment. Just use that. Well, you can't. Every gift is a contract. And it creates obligations that you owe every donor to spend the money in the way that it's intended.
The reason I mention it is some may be surprised to know if you have a drop in revenue, then it's not so easy to make up for it because of the nature of restricted endowments and restricted donors. Anyhow, back to you, Mark. Sorry.
So a related question on the endowment. Are you concerned about the heavy dependence of the UT system on energy as a source of revenues, and this shift towards concerns about global warming and environmentally sustainable growth?
So energy and the 2.1 million acres that the University of Texas system owns and shares with the Texas A&M system in the Permian Basin has been one of the great benefits of this system since the Santarena strike. So it has been an enormous boon to the University of Texas system and to UT Austin and to Texas A&M. And it continues to be. Now the revenue that we'll get from the leases and the use of water and grazing leases, as well as oil and gas, is obviously affected by the energy markets. But once it's transferred, it's managed by our management company, UTIMCO, which is a diversified, a very diversified investor. And we are the largest, we have the most money under management, most private money under management of any university or university system in the country. Now, my friends at Harvard and Yale and Princeton would say their endowment per student is considerably higher, and that would be true. But I think
they may not want to brag about that right now, but yes.
No, it'll get them into trouble. But 2 years ago, we went ahead of Yale, and last year we went ahead of Harvard in total funds under.
That's great.
Next question. So when you took over as Chancellor, what were your most important goals for the UT system? And have they been impacted by the outbreak of the coronavirus?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I mentioned before, and I'm going to try to be consistent. I do believe that the grand challenges are how we educate this enormously growing population so that Texas is as competitive as can possibly be and enjoys the best possible economy in the world, and how we keep people healthy. And those are going to be challenges that tax all of us, but certainly the UT system, which trains about 70% of the interns in the state at one point or another. So this is a huge challenge for us. Now, has it been affected by COVID? Yes, in a way, everything has been impacted by COVID. But I will say that there are some things that happened in COVID. And Rob, this is where I'm going to put in the silver lining bit. First of all, we all worked remotely. I talked to one of my campus presidents who said in the future, he may have 30% of the people who work remotely forever. This is a health science center. It will allow them to use their precious real estate for patient-facing and research activities and move back office off. Second, teaching online. This was going to be a part of how we addressed this huge growth in students. And we went from 18 or 19% of our faculty who did it to 100. So we're learning a lot about it, and actually it's going to help us. And then the third is just one element of the healthcare environment, telemedicine, which is dependent on a lot of things, including the regulatory environment and the payer's willingness to pay for the same kind of doctor's appointment over Zoom as you would have in the office. They're doing that now. Last year, between March and August, we had 1,000 telemedicine appointments across the UT system. This year, between March and August, we had 500,000. And people like it. A lot of people don't mind not sitting in traffic, waiting in a waiting room, being in a place where perhaps there are other sick people. I think this is going to be one of the other things that we have learned during COVID that has compressed the learning period for us, that is going to help us achieve the goals we need to achieve.
So on that, Chancellor, obviously there's an important emphasis on creating a more inclusive economy. And one of the things COVID has accentuated is we've got a lot of challenges ahead of us because Blacks and Hispanics have been disproportionately negatively affected. I'm just wondering, on the diversity front, you might just go through the diversity of the UT system and what your thoughts are on how to create a more inclusive system.
Yeah, so you start with low-income students of any race or ethnicity, which is a huge part of our efforts, and 45% of our students, our undergraduates across the system, receive Pell Grants. So, by the federal government's definition, they are needy. I think 4 of our institutions are Hispanic serving institutions by which you qualify nationally for this designation. UT El Paso, UT Rio Grande Valley, UT San Antonio, UT Arlington, I believe. But UT El Paso, for instance, is high 80s Hispanic student population, maybe 90%. So we have the same challenges that much of probably industry, but much of higher education has that I've seen. And that is, yes, we need to do all we can to provide students the opportunities that they deserve. I mean, one of my core beliefs, Rob, which sort of motivates me, is the idea that talent is universal, that it's distributed without regard to race, gender, ethnicity, zip code, wealth. But the greatest indicator of whether or not you go to a great school, graduate, and get a great job is wealth at birth. And so one of the great responsibilities and roles of public higher education is to try to bring those two together, the talent and the opportunity. And so that's what that's a huge part of what we're doing for students. The challenge that we face that others face, and we have to do a better job of this, is if you look at our faculty ranks, our staff, particularly our senior administrative staff, we don't reflect in any way the percentages of the student body that are Black and Latino and Asian. So that's something that our board is concerned with. You know, we have strategies on that at every one of our institutions and across the board, and it's one that I measure our president's progress on every year. There are very few things that we look at where I say these are the finite set of things that I'm going to talk to you about every year, and that's one of them. And I'm happy to say we're making progress on it, but we need to do better.
I have a question here from Joe May. You mentioned short-term education and certifications as increasing in importance, yet non-education providers have dominated the delivery of these certification programs. Colleges and universities have been slow to incorporate industry-based certifications into their curricula. How can we get higher education to better align curricula with the needs of employers?
Get more people like Joe May running these institutions. Joe and I were on a call earlier this week together talking about some of these very things. You know, when I was in New York and I saw this industry sprouting up of people offering coding or other kinds of sort of just-in-time certificate training, I said, that's our space. These are our students. And I feel the same way in Texas. We have allowed proprietary and non-higher education entities to fill that space because we were slow to fill it. And we have not done a good enough job in higher education across this country of understanding our customers, who are those businesses that are employing our graduates. We need to do a better job of syncing with them and listening to them and providing the courses that students need in the way we can do it and at the cost advantages that we can do it.
So let me just in closing, I'm going to ask you a couple of final questions. One, we have probably a number of people in the audience. Joe May, who's head of Dallas Community College, for those who don't know out there, we're thrilled to have him with us. But there are many others in the audience who may be thinking about getting involved in higher education, either working at a higher education institution or doing more to support higher education. What would you say to those people about why they ought to either think about a career in higher education or how they ought to do more, allocate more of their resources to support higher education?
Well, I'll start with the latter. You know, obviously I'm a true believer, or I wouldn't do what I do. I mean, it has been a marvelous career because I've got to see students achieve their potential and their dreams. And it only takes a few of those people to meet, and you know, you're infected, and you want to do everything you can to see more of those people graduate and get what they can out of life. The other thing, you know, I mentioned the research agenda, and we are second only to the University of California system in the amount of research that we do every year. We have a faculty member at UT Austin who discovered how the coronavirus works, and 4 of the 5 major vaccine companies' efforts are based on his discovery.
Wow.
I mean, so, you know, there are few institutions in our society that have more of an opportunity to change society for the better in educating students and in doing research and in doing healthcare. I mean, you know, places like MD Anderson, UT Southwestern, others that are doing this amazing work. So there are lots of ways to get involved with higher education. Now, to work in higher education, that's you know, another story. But I would say those decisions are going to all be made locally. And you know, if people do have an interest in that, you ought to get to know the local institutions and talk to the leadership there. I think it's as you know, Rob, it's a great career, and great. Even a great sideline.
It's fantastic for the reasons you said. Watch people transformed. It's really a great thrill.
Yeah.
I'll ask one other question. If you look at surveys today, which I do look at these, and you see the confidence, and this is one of our big challenges, the confidence in institutions, and that includes business, government, public sector. Probably the surveys show that there's been some erosion, unfortunately, and it puts a great onus on institutional leaders. How do you think about that as a leader of a very important institution? And what advice would you give to institutional leaders in light of some of these trends? What are 1 or 2 or 3 things they ought to be doing to try to address this?
So a few years ago, I came to UT Austin to give a speech. It's one of my first visits there. And the then president pointed out an inscription on the wall in the tower that says, I'm not going to get this exactly right, but it says something like, the only true endowment of a public university is the confidence of the people. President Benedict, the longest serving president at UT. I think that captures what I believe my responsibility is, our Board of Regents' responsibility, the leadership at our institutions. We have to ensure that we have the confidence of Texans to be able to do our job. And that means that we have to be open and transparent. We have to be trustworthy to have their confidence. But with that confidence comes their commitment to us and their political representatives' commitment to us, which is essential for us to do what we do. So there's nothing more important than earning that trust.
Well, Chancellor Milliken, I just want to say on behalf of all of us and everyone in this community, thank you for your leadership, and thank you for coming from New York down here to Texas and making such
I got here as quickly as I could.
Perfect. Thank you for all that you do and for your leadership, and thanks for being with us here tonight. We enjoyed talking with you.
Thanks, Rob. Really happy to be with you.
Thank you all for joining us this evening. You'll soon receive a survey asking for feedback on this event, and we would very much welcome your candid responses. We hope you'll be able to join us for some of our upcoming Global Perspectives events, which will feature Bank of Mexico Governor Alejandro Diaz de Leon next week, Stanford University Professor John Taylor, and former Bank of England Governor Mark Carney. Details on how to register for these events can be found at dallasfed.org. And with that, we are adjourned. Have a good evening.